This is a conversation with Sabrîna Azad. She's a writer who published a moving piece for Mongol media entitled From Halabja to Ghouta, in which she looked at how deniers of Assad's war crimes in Syria were evoking painful memories for survivors of Saddam Hussein's genocidal campaigns against Kurds. She spoke about the legacy of the Halabja massacre, part of the Anfal genocide of the late 80s, as well as the 1991 uprisings against Saddam, and why they offer better insight into the world's reaction to Syria since 2011 than the more frequently mentioned 2003 invasion of Iraq does. As usual, you can follow this podcast on Twitter at FireTheseTimes or on Instagram at TheFireTheseTimes. You can also support it on Patreon or on buymeacoffee.com, the links to which are in the description. Thank you for your time.
I'm Sabrina. I study toxicology and the histories of mountain regions in the East. I also do data analysis and visualizations on a wide assortment of things: refugee rights, war crimes, and especially anti-authoritarian movements with a focus on Kurdish issues. So yeah, thank you so much for having me today.
So the topic of our conversation is a rather heavy one, let's be honest. You're speaking, like if I could summarize it, and obviously I'll ask you to do so in a better way. It's about two of the most notorious war crimes in modern Middle Eastern history, which is obviously saying quite a lot. And I want you, if that's okay, to just give us a bit about the background for this piece and tell us a bit about like why did you feel the need to write it in the first place?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, they're two of the biggest war crimes in the region, and there's actually a lot of articles out there on them that I saw, but they're mostly from a very geopolitical lens. Whether they deny the chemical attacks and take, Russia's stance, or even the ones that affirm them, we'll talk about the need to assert American supremacy over Russia. And that's really not what the uprising's about. It's not even what the victims want. So I saw people who are sort of, I don't know, thinking they're being clever by bringing up Halabja to explain, why nothing should be done about what the Assad regime is doing today. So I thought, who better to consult than the actual victims of Saddam's chemical attacks, because, it's their tragedies which are being used as a political toy, so many years later. And, all we hear is what white people in the West think about Syria or what should be done there. And, my view as someone from the global South has usually been that, wrongful inaction or like enabling a dictator in the past, it doesn't mean that there should be inaction or enabling, for the rest of all eternity. That doesn't make any sense. And especially when it comes to something as monumental as chemical attacks. And I'll get into this a little bit later about why they're so important. But basically, as I listened to older survivors from Kurdish and also Iranian communities, I realized that most very strongly supported the strikes on the regime after its chemical attacks, or at least some form of enforcing a red line, the red line that Obama had mentioned but never actually enforced. And, I couldn't find any article that really focused on what these people were saying was the best course of action, the people who've actually been through this exact situation before. And there was really nothing out there about the solidarity between the victims between different countries. And I think it was really important to highlight this because we don't get a lot of that. There's so much sectarian and racist propaganda that comes from our region that we really need to highlight every opportunity that we get when we do see very genuine grassroots solidarity. There was people in Rojhelat, the part of Kurdistan under Iranian military rule, and they went out to the streets. They carried posters, in solidarity with Syrian victims, and it wasn't thousands and thousands, but it was it was still a sizable amount, and there was no media attention on this at all. I mean, I only knew this because I know people from there, and so I really wanted to honor the anniversary of the Halabja massacre by amplifying these arguments, which are so overlooked. But I think also the personal narratives, they're really crucial to remind people that at the end of the day, these are human beings' stories, not pawns in a geopolitical chess game of sorts, which I think is how a lot of people view this whole thing, which is why they'll be like, oh, but what about Halabja? Nobody did anything there, so why should they do anything about what the Assad regime is doing now?
Like, to the best of your ability, can you tell us a bit about the Halabja chemical attack?
Yeah, for sure. So the Halabja chemical attack was sort of the culmination of the unfilled genocide which had been happening. So some people put the date starting at 1986. Some people put it, just as 1988 at the height of the campaign. But basically, it was during. So the genocide itself was like, how do I say, an event within an event of which was the Iran-Iraq War, which I don't think people realize like quite how much that war impacted politics in the region for still today. Actually, it consolidated the revolution in Iran. It allowed Khomeini to like maintain power because when you're being invaded by another country, you sort of rally around whichever leader is like the most potent at the time. And so it really a lot of different factions that were in the Iranian Revolution, they were basically slammed out once Saddam invaded. So it really had an impact on Iran, obviously. And so Halabja in particular was so when Saddam invaded Iran, Iraqi Kurdish forces actually aligned with Iran because they saw it as an opportunity to get rid of this regime. And so to punish them for this, obviously, so Saddam took it out on Kurdish civilians, as dictators do. And so what it started out as sort of rounding up young Kurdish men, executing them. Actually, the rate of this was so high that I think this and the genocide in Bosnia actually sort of gave rise to the term gendercide, which is like when you specifically target not only like a specific ethnicity or religion, but also specifically young men. So it was like really monumental in terms of that. And so Halabja specifically was sort of the culmination of all of this. That town was at the time under Iranian military occupation. So there's footage, an Iranian soldier right after the Halabja attack happened, and he was basically saying, we understand like why Saddam attacked, Iranian soldiers with chemical weapons, we're his enemy. So, okay, that's all right. But, how can you attack your own people? And then this sort of is like, sort of plays into the genocidal ideology that the Saddam regime happened. So it was a very logical culmination of it, but just the manner in which it was done was, I think, very shocking to the world. So yeah, that's sort of the background of the massacre itself.
And the one we're obviously not comparing it to, you can never compare it to massacres or anything like this, but the one in which, in any case, we saw sort of irrelevant echoes, especially in the lack of responses, which in a way, I have this issue whenever people talk about, not in the context you mentioned, of course, but in general when people talk about inaction, because inaction is a sort of action in itself, if you see what I mean. And quite a lot of my political or even personal development has really been defined by the Ghouta chemical attack, which, for those who don't know, Ghouta is is a region in Syria, and the chemical attack happened on the 21st of August 2013. And to this day, it's still one of the worst war crimes that were committed in Syria, which, again, obviously, it's saying quite a lot. And the thing about the Ghouta chemical attack, and this will lead me a bit to the question I wanted to ask you, is it also saw, in addition to the geopolitical consequences and obviously the real life consequences on victims, it also became this sort of a starting point. It happened before as well, but really Ghouta 2013 was for me one of the starting points of this massive disinformation online war, basically online campaign, largely by the Russian government itself or its supporters, sometimes paid, sometimes not even paid. Some people do this for free. And it's kind of it's become a sort of cliche among many Middle Eastern activists. I feel that that the last thing many so-called quote unquote anti-imperialists in the West, basically the last thing they know about the region, if it's not Israel-Palestine related, is the 2003 imperialist invasion of Iraq. And they may have some limited knowledge of the 2011 uprisings, especially in its early days, but in my view, that sort of it died out relatively quickly, like towards the end of 2011 or something like this, which is when indifference sort of came back in a sense. And whenever and here I'm using we a bit loosely, I guess, but it's like whenever we mention the need for anything to be done about Assad's now 9 years long extermination campaign, And the crime of extermination was actually a term used by the UN because they couldn't legally, I suppose, use the word genocide. We often get people who say, but what about 2003? What about the weapons of mass destruction? The last time the mainstream media said this and that. And besides the racist assumptions, obviously, that nothing of significance happened in almost 2 decades now, that people should inform themselves as if, Iraqis and let alone Syrians were just doing nothing for the past 2 decades. There's also the irony here is that Saddam did in fact use, as you say in your article, he did actually use weapons of mass destruction. And you actually go back to this context, and you mentioned the context of the 1991 uprisings in Iraq and in Kurdistan. Can you tell us a bit about these uprisings and a bit of the overview? Again, as much as you can. People can do their own researches, of course. But like, what are some similarities as well? Like, in addition to some of the overview, what are some of the similarities that you see between these uprisings and the ones that we've been seeing since 2011?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the 1991, I think what most people in the West know about 1991 is, Saddam invades Kuwait. US-led coalition forces, sort of intervene to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait. And this is where I think their knowledge sort of stops on 1991. But the thing is, after this sort of whole debacle in Kuwait, George Bush Senior, he made an appeal on the radio, telling Iraqis, that a way for them to end the violence and the oppression by the Saddam regime would be for Iraqis themselves to remove Saddam. And so when he said this, what the U.S. actually wanted was they wanted Iraq to be ruled in the sort of like by a military regime, but without Saddam. So they weren't concerned about democracy or anything at all, of course, but they just wanted to get rid of Saddam because, he was frankly annoying to them. And so Iraqis and Kurds answered this call very enthusiastically. And I want to point out here that, they might have been encouraged by the West. And by encouraged, I mean they believed that, okay, if Saddam, retaliates, which he will, that, the West will support us. That's really all they expected from the West. But the thing that motivated them the most was their own grievances with the regime. These are people who had lost mothers, sisters, brothers, fathers to this awful dictatorship. They didn't need someone from the US to tell them, hey, go and like risk your life to get rid of Saddam. They would have done it, but, they wanted that reassurance. So on their way back from Kuwait, and there are sort of like mixed accounts of how the exact moment that it started, but one account is that an Iraqi soldier, shot a portrait of Saddam, and this sort of symbolic event snowballed into the uprising. And so, soldiers defected from the army, turned against the regime. A lot of Iraqi Shia dissidents who'd been exiled to Iran returned, and they'd sort of been inspired by the 1979 revolution in Iran and wanted to turn Iraq into a sort of, similar Islamic republic. But they weren't the only rebels by any means. And I think this is very important to point out. The armed rebellion was a very diverse movement. It included leftists, communists, Kurds, anti-Saddam, Arab nationalists, all sorts of people, similar to the Syrian uprising. It wasn't just one ideology that motivated. And so the rebels were able to liberate the majority of the provinces. It wasn't limited to a certain area, like perhaps maybe the 1982 Hama uprising in Syria sort of was. But I'll point out the way that this 1991 uprising in Iraq was different from the Syrian Revolution is that the Syrian Revolution started out as peaceful protests, whereas the 1991 uprising did begin as an armed rebellion, but for several reasons. One of which is that, Saddam was much more, I guess, openly warmongering than the Assad regime in terms of outright invading his neighbors. So there was never really an opportunity to get normal protests going. And this is kind of why I hate when people use the term, stable to refer to life under any authoritarian regime, particularly Saddam's, because it makes it sound like as if Iraq under Saddam was like Disneyland, simply minding its own business, didn't fight more than one war with its neighbors, not to mention the rate of Saddam's, repression of dissidents. And so going back to the uprising, the Shia majority South and the Kurdish North, they were liberated for a short time period. Then this is when we'll see a lot of parallels with the Syrian counter-revolution. So Saddam forces responded with very brutal violence. There's horrifying footage out there of women and children trapped in a shrine in Karbala, basically, practically begging for God to save them because Saddam's military aircraft was basically gunning down civilians on the streets. And here we'll get into like one of the US's biggest betrayals, I think, in the region, which is when a lot of Kurds and Iraqi Shia, so Western troops were still next door, due to the whole thing with Kuwait, and so they asked them for arms and weapons to protect themselves from being gunned down, by Saddam's military aircraft. But they were rejected because the West, sort of feared an Iranian-style revolution happening in Iraq, sort of similar to how they fear like a Sunni Islamist takeover of Syria. We hear that time and time again. And so this betrayal by George Bush, and it wasn't until I think 2011 that the U.S. ambassador to Iraq actually apologized for this inaction. And I forget who it was, but an Iraqi Shia leader said, like, yeah, absolutely, if you had supported us in 1991, that would have been a lot better than what you did in 2003, because, and this is key, in 1991 the uprising was led by the people. And so this sort of betrayal was like stayed in the mind of a lot of Iraqi Shia, and the reason why even people who celebrated Saddam's fall didn't trust the U.S., and rightfully so. I mean, this is a huge betrayal. The death toll is like from I think like 20,000 to over 150,000, all within the span of the month. So you can imagine, like, even the Syrian counter-revolution took a long time to reach this sort of death toll. And so I think a lot of commentators sort of ask, okay, why would Iraqis or Kurds trust the U.S. in the first place? And I even saw this question asked in, I think, in October, when Turkish-backed forces were sort of attacking Kurds in Syria. And I think there's sort of an arrogance, I guess I could say, that underlines this question. It sort of assumes that people in the region don't know that the U.S. can be very two-faced. And I'm reminded of a list that you actually put together of Syrian responses to Max Blumenthal's articles that sort of slandered the Syria campaign. And then one of them, basically says, yes, Max, the campaign is calling for a no-fly zone, and that's because a no-fly zone is what Syrians have been begging for day and night. And so this type of reaction, that asks for protection, I think flies over the head of many Westerners, because they don't see human beings when they look at Iraq or when they look at Syria or Kurdistan or wherever. They just see like geopolitical games, I guess. So the fact that the same civilians who have suffered from Western imperialism may still ask the West for help in the face of genocide is something they can't really comprehend or don't want to comprehend, because they never really been in a situation as tough as that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So this was a very monumental event in the history of Iraq and Kurdistan. One grave uncovered after the invasion had as many as 10,000 Shia victims in a single grave. So you can just imagine the scale of this. And these facts are really important to consider if someone wants to know, sort of the reasoning behind a lot of the sectarian conflicts that broke out after the fall of Saddam. It wasn't just, okay, Saddam fell and so everybody started going crazy. Like, no, it had to do a lot with grievances from the past. And so I think Iraq 1991 is a better comparison to Syria since 2011 than Iraq 2003, because Iraq 2003 was an invasion. It was a regime change led by foreign forces, though, of course, ordinary Kurds and Iraqi Shia still celebrated the fall of Saddam, because why wouldn't they? But Syria 2011 was a popular uprising. And so this is why the comparisons to Iraq 2003 really don't work at all, because 2003, again, was an invasion led by foreign forces. So I always say to people, if you ever get hit with this argument, what about Iraq 2003? Always even ask the people who are saying this, are you aware of Iraq 1991? Because then you would know the price of not, supporting popular revolutions when they do happen. And a lot of the tactics Saddam's forces used to crush this 1991 uprising are very similar to the ones that the Assad regime would use. So, Saddam loyalists would very openly shout, anti-Shia slogans. They targeted Shia cities. So it was very deliberate. And, we see the same thing with Assad regime soldiers and their anti-Sunni slogans and the targeting of holy sites. So it's very similar. I always say, just flip the book pages of the book back to Saddam, and you'll sort of predict everything that's happening in Syria now. And I think Syria is actually headed to a post-1991 Iraq type situation, a popular uprising crushed by a dictator, because the rebels were very outgunned, and the country will stay broken and sanctioned, and there's really no positive outcome from what people, when people say like, okay, just let the Assad regime take over. Well, so the Saddam regime did take over the rest of the Shia majority south, and it didn't really end well for anybody. So I think even this comparison doesn't work in any way, but it's really hard to explain this if someone doesn't even know the basics of Iraqi history, which is the case, I think, for a lot of the people whose knowledge of Iraq starts from 2003, as if nothing happened, before or after.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I can, sense the frustration in your voice. It's something I understand fairly well. I'm not Syrian myself. I'm Lebanese. It's just, and I would never claim to know what Syrians are going through. It's just something that, yeah, I just became intimately aware of through personal connections and through work and everything. One thing, so this is true. I didn't actually know this, which I think speaks a bit to my own maybe disillusionment or disconnect or whatever it is. But I knew, for example, that when there was during the fall of Aleppo, during or right after that period, so that was end of 2016. I remember the memorials and the stories that were coming out from Bosnia, from Sarajevo, of people, you know, um, basically saying we know what this feels like, we know what it feels like to be abandoned, and so on and so forth. And that made sense to me, but somehow I think by coincidence, just shortly before actually reading your piece, I didn't even think of just looking to the east of Ghouta, not even that far away compared to Sarajevo. You write that many Iraqi Kurds, especially those from Halabja, obviously were kind of reliving their traumas when they heard of the Assad regime's chemical massacre in eastern Ghouta in 2013. One person that you quote in the piece even said that this was Halabja all over again. You already did speak a bit about this, so feel free to expand, or you can say that was enough as you wish. But like, can you speak a bit more about the what reliving trauma can look like? And obviously, I mean, not look like, but like, yeah, just express it in the way you feel most comfortable. This is obviously very difficult. I'm not expecting a perfect analysis. I don't even think that exists. But like, yeah, just in terms of maybe the emotional side of things, to try and move away from this obsession with geopolitics as though we're all just pawns in some big empire's games. How did something like the chemical massacre in 2013, how was it perceived by many survivors from the earlier massacres in Halabja and the genocide?
Yeah, for sure. So I think a lot of people don't kind of understand, what is the big deal about chemical weapons, or, how particularly horrifying the effects they can have on a civilian population can be. So, okay, so Kurds have been hostile to the Iraqi state to some degree or another pretty much since its inception. But whatever small chance there was at, sort of reconciling Kurdish self-determination within Iraq essentially died at Halabja, because the level of like distrust and trauma as a result of these kind of attacks, it's practically one of a kind. I don't think any of the Syrian victims who've suffered from chemical attacks are ever going to see not only the Assad regime, but even the idea of Syria in the same way. And so chemical attacks really have a psychological effect to a much greater extent than most other weapons, even though, of course, all weapons kill, injure, and, ideally we don't want any weapons being used against civilians. But this is why the chemical attacks in Syria reawakened, so many nightmares for Iraqi Kurds, because you never really get those images or that experience or even the stories out of your head. And in the piece, I think I mentioned the example of, for example, I wanted to give like because we always get the question, okay, why would Assad use chemical weapons when he's quote unquote winning? And so I really wanted to address this in the piece. And so I mentioned the example of a Free Syrian Army Brigade, which had been fighting the regime for years and, never really gave up. But the moment he switched to chemical weapons, that's when they sort of called it quits. And so, that should really give an answer to these people who constantly ask why, why would he use it when he's winning? A totalitarian regime has a very different definition of winning than most people do, or, even most governments. And so the question, I think, when you talk to like survivors about, oh, why would a regime use this when they're winning? It's sort of like a joke question to them. They're like, I don't think you understand why these weapons are used in the first place. It's not just like, oh, I just want to regain a territory. No, there's a very deliberate message that these kind of weapons sent. Otherwise he would just use conventional weapons. And so a lot of Kurds have correctly pointed out that if the world had taken a moral stance on Halabja, regardless of politics, but just a moral stance, then it would have been a lot less easy for the Assad regime to get away with chemical attacks in Syria, which and people have only heard about like one or two, I would say, or maybe five tops of the chemical attacks in Syria. There have been over 300. So this is not like, oh, it's just happening once a year. No, this is happening, over dozens of times each year. And I also want to stress that the normalization of chemical weapons actually just hasn't been limited to Syria. In fact, and a lot of people don't know this, which is really unfortunate, but in 2016, the regime in Sudan under Bashir used chemical weapons on civilians in Darfur. And unfortunately, this got, pretty much no media attention. But, so when chemical attacks are ignored in one place, it just makes the entire world more dangerous in the long run, because it again, like we've sort of been hearing a lot of Syrian activists say this, but what's happening in Syria, it's not going to stay in Syria. And there have already been so many examples of this, and this is just another one. You don't want to normalize chemical weapons. I'll get into that a little bit more later, but yeah, so basically in terms of the trauma, it's really incomparable. And I think only another example I could give is the when the attacks first happened in Syria, and Iranian soldiers who are backing the Assad regime in Syria heard about this. A lot of them, and there's like articles and interviews about this, a lot of them immediately reconsidered why their like support for the regime. And these are people who up until that point had been killing Syrian civilians. So you can just imagine like the level of not just trauma, but I guess the psychological effects in general that it has. It makes even the people who are sort of carrying out this genocide reconsider. So it's really hard to explain, but I think with these sort of tangible examples, people can kind of see that it's not just like using any other weapon.
Yeah, and the whole why would he use this if he's already quote unquote winning? It it reminded me of Razan Zaitouni, who you yourself quoted in your article. Razan, for those who don't know, a very well known, very beloved Syrian activist and lawyer, founded the Violation and or co-founded the Violation and Documentation Center, and was based in Eastern Ghouta when the 2013 massacre happened. Razan was interviewed by Democracy Now! At the time, in an interview that is kind of like I don't know, it's like a scar in my in my mind. I just remember it so clearly, even though I watched it I think only once because I couldn't handle to watch it again. But you had on the one, and people can find it online. It's easily available. I'm actually gonna we'll put the link as well in the recommended reading and watching list on the blog post. She was talking obviously under duress. Her English pretty good, but like not fluent. There's an accent there, and she's obviously talking from the phone under limited, very difficult conditions. Let's put it mildly. And on the other hand, you had Cockburn, a journalist, American journalist, or I think he used to be a journalist. I don't know what he is now. Basically kind of just downplaying what she was saying and essentially using a variation of that argument. Like, why would he do it? Assad knows that if he uses chemical weapons, the Obama administration will punish him because that's what Obama said he'll do. And yet, lo and behold, Razan was obviously right. She unfortunately paid a very difficult price for being so principled just a few months after, with her kidnapping, very likely by Jaish al-Islam, one the rebel group that was dominating militarily and politically in Eastern Ghouta. We haven't heard from her since, so it's been almost 6 years and a half now. And that's it. That was the end of it. Cockburn continued to write stuff after that. Razan was kidnapped. Democracy Now! Continued. As far as I know, they seem to have, I don't want to focus on Democracy Now! There's nothing personal, there's much worse than what they did. At least they've spoken to Razan, other people didn't even bother that on the so-called left. So yeah, sorry, I just wanted to kind of bring them up. And the whole why would he do that actually leads me quite well, unfortunately, to the next question, which is that it's become very common for us, again, I'm using us very loosely, to kind of associate the Assad regime with a slogan that is repeated by his supporters, that I've heard myself with my own ears by Hezbollah supporters in Lebanon, and usually you're just associated with with regime militias and soldiers, either by Iran, usually Syrians, sometimes Iraqis, which is Assad or we burn the country. And we've seen it written on walls of besieged, outside of besieged areas and so on. But yeah, like this slogan, there kind of already was an equivalent, and you do talk about this. You know, the Saddam regime, his cousin so even gained the title, the name of Chemical Ali. He raised, I'm using information in your piece. He raised an estimated 2,000 Kurdish villages to the ground. And in one audio tape, and I'll ask you to kind of comment on this generally, he said, and here I'm quoting, "I will kill them all with chemical weapons. Who will protest? The international community? Fuck the international community and those who pay attention to it. I will not just attack them with chemicals on one day. Instead, I will continue for 15 days. And if someone is reading this and still thinking that here we're dealing with a situation where this is rational, quote unquote, as if these people are sitting, around a bureau or desk and saying, well, this is going to be enough. We shouldn't do more than this because then we might have consequences, as if it's all some kind of genius calculation, one of those board games like Risk or whatever. It does betray, and like obviously completely agree with you, it does betray a complete disconnect with the realities on the ground, because winning, as you said, doesn't look the same. For Bashar al-Assad, when we say Assad or we burn the country, it's meant literally. It's not a metaphor for anything. It's literally meant either I stay in power or we burn the country. He even used the term useful Syria to describe the Syria that is under his control, obviously. In some parts of Syria, the poorer parts, the parts that are not in between Aleppo and Damascus, for example, some in the north, some in the south, they are simply not as important to him. And he said so almost explicitly himself. When another relative of Saddam, and here again we're seeing the same Ba'athist logic, I guess, of having families run everything. Another relative of Saddam, General Maher Abdel Rashid, who I think is the father-in-law of his son. Yeah, that's it. He said, "If you gave me a pesticide to throw at these swarms of insects to make them breathe and become exterminated, I would use it." And this whole dehumanizing language, cockroaches, insects, it's become such a common pattern. It's like chapter 1 of the rule book of how a dictatorial regime is going to act, that it kind of baffles me to this day that we don't see the writings on the wall as soon as this kind of language is used. And in the case of Assad, we heard this language by mid 2011 we were already hearing this kind of language. So I was wondering, and this will tie into what you already spoke about, so again, feel free to expand as you wish, if you can more broadly speak about your own experience, about how your own experience informed your reading or your reactions, I guess, of what's been happening in Syria, specifically in Syria since 2011, and maybe you can also talk about wider context, Iraq, the recent uprisings. That's as you feel most comfortable. But especially, I would be very interested in hearing what you have to say about how you have been, just your experience of Syria since 2011, if that makes sense.
Hi, my name is Efe Levant. I am the editor-in-chief of Mangal Media, an online publication for writers and artists from the so-called periphery. We publish a wide range of material, including investigative journalism, personal essays, and short stories. We of course also share memes on social media. Mangal Media is supported entirely by reader donations, so make sure to also check out our Patreon page and browse our exclusive supporter rewards.
Yeah, so I think to understand sort of the first, I'll just address the chemical attacks part and the rhetoric, and then I'll get a little bit more to the general uprisings. So I think to understand the use of modern chemical warfare and this kind of rhetoric that compares the targeted population of the genocide to pests or insects, we should really look at the roots of chemical warfare in the modern era. So sarin gas in particular was actually invented by a scientist in Nazi Germany, and his original task he was originally tasked with creating a pesticide that was supposed to keep pests from eating plants so that Germany could rely on domestic products instead of importing it from elsewhere. So sarin started out as a project to get rid of pests. And you can sort of guess where this is going when you consider the rhetoric of tyrants who have used sarin and other chemical weapons. Hitler, for example, used Zyklon B. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but I think, and that's another type of chemical agent, but it's a blood agent, not a nerve agent like sarin. But the point is, he used them on Jewish civilians in gas chambers, and some could kill up to 10,000 people at once, which really shows the genocidal intention you would need to have to even use such a thing. And so there are a lot of theories out there as to why Hitler never used them on enemy soldiers, and he only used them on innocent Jewish men, women, and children. And I said this in the piece, I think, that conventional weapons send this message that, okay, we can kill you wherever we want. But chemical weapons send a slightly different message, which is that we can kill you however we want. And the second part really is, it sort of, again, like goes back to the genocidal intentions, but it's sort of like, okay, we not only control, whether you live or die, but how you live or die, which is, a step worse if that's even possible. And so this is why one of them can really change the course of a war or an uprising in a matter of moments, just solely because of the psychological trauma inflicted. And so this sort of, exterminatory language that we see with, the Assad regime officials, or, Saddam before them, is actually, yeah, exactly, very logical, given their views of, useful Syria. I mean, when you say only certain parts of my country are useful, you're basically saying the rest of it is populated by, things we can get rid of. And this is the implication of it. And they're very honest about it too. So I never understand why there's so much, confusion about what is motivating the regime. I mean, they very clearly tell you, not just Assad himself, but the Shabiha, like all of his supporters are very clear about it too. And I think it was, Martin Luther King Jr. who said, genocide is the logical conclusion of racism. I mean, it very clearly leads, when you go from saying, okay, only certain parts of my country are useful, it's not at all a big step from going there to, gassing people with sarin. It's just a progression. And so, even before UNFOL, for example, the Saddam regime's crimes, included rounding up and executing, I think around 5,000 to 8,000, young Kurdish men on the spot. So, it's really not surprising that something like Halabja would happen. I think what was surprising is that people actually saw it on their TV screens. And I guess fortunately back then there wasn't this, disinformation campaign that Syrians unfortunately have to deal with. And even I'm shocked at the level of, any post about the chemical attacks, even ones that don't mention the perpetrator, but just, extend some sort of sympathy to the victims, are just swarmed by denialists. And I don't know how Syrians deal with it, but I think it is important for us to keep combating this propaganda. But yeah, so in Syria, we can talk about the uprising since 2011. So we mentioned with the Saddam regime, their sort of targeting of young Kurdish men. So in Syria, the targeting of not Kurdish men, but predominantly young Sunni Arab men is very clear in terms of who is being killed, tortured, and detained. Anybody can just look at the statistics. It's very disproportionate, and it's not just in Syria. Like this kind of a very going back to that concept I mentioned earlier of gendercide, which targets not only a certain population, but particularly the young men in that population. Israel uses this kind of rhetoric against Palestinians. Turkey uses it against Kurds. And, we see it now, even Europe uses it against refugees by saying, it's okay to shoot migrants if they're not women and children, as if young men aren't deserving of human rights. So again, this goes back to the idea that, what happens in Syria doesn't stay in Syria. The sort of dehumanizing fascist logic that we see, it's already gone way beyond the borders of Syria. And so another thing that I wanted to talk about with regards to the uprising is the nature of the Ba'athist regimes. So by I think June of 2011, and I've just pulled up some numbers here, but the tally of the casualties from all the countries that sort of experienced the Arab Spring, the tally of the casualties was very high. In Tunisia, it was around hundreds, and it says in Syria the number exceeded 1,000, and in Libya it was much higher. So when we hear people say, okay, Bahrain had revolution, why did it end up like Syria? Well, you have to consider the different natures of the regime. Yes, there's a lot of, regimes that are authoritarian, but there are different extents. And I'm blanking out on who said this, but in terms of the the rate of repression, the Assad regime in Syria is really only comparable by Gaddafi in Libya and Saddam in Iraq. There's not really that many other regimes in the region that do have this kind of, this will reburn the country entirely sort of logic. And I think the reason a lot of, at least I've noticed, leftists in the West sort of, I don't know, they don't believe it, they don't want to accept it. I don't really know what motivates them, but I think the reason they don't understand this is because they find it hard to believe that, dictators in the global south can be, as murderous as Hitler or Stalin. And I think the reason it's hard for so many people to acknowledge this is because they sort of think people from the East have no agency, have no capacity to commit great evil or do great good. So by their logic, only people in the West have the brains and agency to, shift the course of history, to start revolutions or end them, whether for better or worse. Whereas, the revolution that started in Syria in 2011 is similar to revolutions that have been happening all over the global south. And at the heart of it really is people realizing, hey, we are just as deserving of freedom and democracy as anybody else. And, that like these regimes, they talk big, but at the end of the day, their guns aren't aimed at Western imperialism or, Israel or whatever. Their guns are aimed at us. And so I was watching an interview, I'm just remembering now, with Nisreen Alamin, who's from Sudan. And she was talking about, for example, when Sudanese protesters, and this isn't Syria particularly, but it relates back. So they targeted, I think, an oil or gas station. And a lot of people thought, oh, they're just rioting, they're just causing chaos. But she was explaining that it was actually a very symbolic protest against the regime because, Sudan is a very naturally rich country, and it was the regime which had been stealing the Sudanese people's money. And so for outsiders, they don't know all this context and nuance. Even I didn't know this until I heard, an actual person from Sudan speak about it. And so if you don't listen to people from the region, with regards to the Syrian uprising from 2011, I think you mentioned at the beginning, people know a little bit about the beginning, like, oh, there was an uprising, but, they don't care to learn more. And I think it really has a detriment because, they don't just stop at, okay, we don't know anything about Syria. It always goes a step further and they say, it's CIA-backed coup or, whatever they say. So, if people sort of accept, okay, I don't know much about this place, but I'm willing to learn, then I think, we would be in a much better place now, unfortunately. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. So, here we are, fighting chemical weapons denialism, which is, probably the worst place we could be. And this idea, that sort of so-called Western standards of human rights are exclusive to the West, it's really a racist idea. And unfortunately, it's shared by both the left and the right. And I wish it was just limited to them, but unfortunately, dictators throughout the global south actually weaponize this belief. I think I remember an Indian politician saying that Western standards of human rights, don't apply to India. And so you can imagine how a person who says something like this will, treat his own people. And so I think we really need to be, as you mentioned, when the Assad regime says, supporters say Assad or we burn the country, they really mean it. It's not a metaphor. And that's why I always say flip back the page to the Saddam regime because then you'll see how a Ba'athist government actually operates. What does it do in the face of an uprising? It's already all happened. Of course, the context is a little bit different, but it's all very clear. So there's really nothing surprising, to be honest, about what's happening in Syria. I guess very sad to say, but yeah. So I always say, go back to read up on the Saddam regime because it will really give you an idea of the level of brutality that such a regime is willing to use.
Yeah, I mean, it's like that, often used quote, I think was it by Audre Lorde? I don't remember, but, when someone tells you who they are, believe them, like something along those lines,
yes,
obviously. Sabrina, you've been very, very generous with your time. Is there anything that you wish we could have talked about, but didn't have time to, or maybe if you wanted to end on some kind of general note, just go for it.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess my general note would be for people to really prioritize the voices of survivors, even when considering policy responses to any horrific event. I think it's very important to listen to the people who are actually experiencing it because otherwise you really fall into this trap of as we mentioned, geopolitical chess, which is, just incredibly dehumanizing and, just downright racist. So don't do that.
I obviously, I think that's a very good note. And Sabrina, thanks a lot for your time.
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much for having me.